Walsh stood in the marble-floored lobby of Cedar Falls Community Bank, clutching a folder containing 3 years of meticulously gathered financial documents. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see her husband Brandon's pickup truck parked outside Kowalski Sons Construction across the street, the company logo gleaming in the afternoon Oregon sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Brandon didn't know was that his wife wasn't here for a personal loan or to open a savings account. She was here to make the largest acquisition in Cedar Falls history, purchasing the very business that had been dismissing her ideas for over a decade. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just that morning, she'd overheard Brandon on the phone with his brother Trevor, their voices carrying through the thin walls of their split-level home. "She's finally extinct," Brandon had laughed, thinking Diana was out grocery shopping. 3 years of her business suggestions, and she's given up. Thank God, maybe now she'd focus on what she's actually good at. The casual cruelty of those words had stung, but they'd also crystallized something Diana had been building toward for months. If they wanted to treat her like she was invisible, she'd use that invisibility to her advantage. Diana Walsh had never intended to become invisible in her own marriage. When she'd married Brandon Kowalski 8 years ago, she'd been the rising star project manager at Portland Tech Solutions, coordinating million-dollar software implementations and managing teams of developers across 3 time zones. She'd been the one who could see patterns others missed, who could anticipate problems before they derailed entire projects, who could transform chaotic situations into streamlined successes. But Cedar Falls was a small town with traditional expectations, and Kowalski Sons Construction was a third-generation family business with even more traditional ways of thinking. When Diana had relocated from Portland to support Brandon's role as operations manager in the family company, she'd assumed her business experience would be welcomed, perhaps even sought after. She'd been spectacularly wrong. The Kowalski family compound sat on 12 acres of prime Cedar Falls real estate, with the original farmhouse where Brandon's grandfather had started the business, still standing alongside the modern office complex built in the 90s. Everything about the place screamed established success, from the custom stone walkways to the hand-carved wooden sign that read Kowalski Sons, building Cedar Falls since 1952. What it didn't scream was innovation, adaptation, or any awareness that the construction industry had fundamentally changed in the past decade. Diana's first family dinner had been a masterclass in polite dismissal. Robert Kowalski, the silver-haired patriarch who still came to the office every day at 73, had asked about her background with what seemed like genuine interest. When she'd mentioned her experience in project management software and digital workflow optimization, the table had gone quiet except for the sound of silverware against china. "That's nice, dear," Robert had finally said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "But construction is about relationships, not computers. You can't build trust with an algorithm." Trevor, Brandon's older brother and the company's current president, had nodded sagely while cutting his pot roast. "Dad's right. We've been doing things the same way for 70 years because it works. Why fix what isn't broken?" Diana had bitten her tongue then, choosing diplomacy over confrontation. She'd smiled and nodded and asked about the weather, filing away her observations for later consideration. But she'd also noticed things they hadn't mentioned. The way Robert's hand shook slightly when he reached for his water glass, suggesting the patriarch's involvement might not be as permanent as everyone assumed. The defensive edge in Trevor's voice when he talked about their methods, as if he'd been having this conversation more often lately. The way Brandon avoided making eye contact when the topic of business came up, focusing instead on his plate with unusual intensity. Over the following months, Diana had tried various approaches to contribute. She'd volunteered to help with their project management during family gatherings, mentioning new software that could streamline their scheduling and reduce costly delays. Trevor had laughed it off. "We've got a whiteboard and a good memory. That's all we need." She'd offered to research digital marketing strategies when she'd overheard them discussing declining bid opportunities. Brandon had patted her hand condescendingly. "Honey, our clients find us through word of mouth. We don't need to be on the internet." The most painful rejection had come when she'd presented a comprehensive analysis of industry trends, complete with charts showing how traditional construction companies were losing market share to more agile competitors. She'd spent weeks researching, compiling data on everything from customer expectations to profit margins in the digital age. She'd presented it during a Sunday dinner, spreading her materials across Robert's dining room table with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed she could help. The response had been swift and crushing. "Diana," Robert had said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of construction experience, "I appreciate that you want to help, but this isn't the tech world. Construction is about craftsmanship, relationships, and reputation. Those things don't change just because someone invents a new app." Trevor had been less diplomatic. "No offense, but you've never swung a hammer or managed a job site. Maybe stick to what you know." Brandon had said nothing during the presentation. But later that night, he'd been brutally honest. "Look, I know you mean well, but you're embarrassing yourself. These guys have forgotten more about construction than you'll ever know. Just because you managed some computer programmers doesn't mean you understand real business." That night, lying in bed while Brandon snored beside her, Diana had made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to dismiss her expertise, fine. If they thought her ideas were worthless, she wouldn't waste any more time trying to convince them. But she also wouldn't waste her skills sitting on the sidelines, playing the role of the dutiful wife who smiled and nodded while watching. A family business slowly strangled itself with outdated thinking. She'd started small, taking a part-time job at Mountain Brew, the local coffee shop that had become Cedar Falls' unofficial networking hub. The pay was minimal, but the position gave her something invaluable: access to every conversation, complaint, and frustration in the local business community. She learned that the Kowalski contracts were increasingly going over budget and behind schedule. She discovered that 3 major clients had quietly switched to competitors in the past year. She found out that several subcontractors were discussing forming their own partnership because they were frustrated with Kowalski Sons' inflexible approach to scheduling and communication. Most importantly, she learned that the construction industry in Cedar Falls was ripe for disruption. New residential developments were demanding smart home integration that Kowalski Sons couldn't provide. Commercial clients were requiring project management transparency that the company's paper-based systems couldn't deliver. Younger homeowners wanted contractors who could communicate through modern channels, not just phone calls and handwritten estimates. Diana began documenting everything in a series of notebooks that she kept hidden in her car. She tracked project timelines, budget overruns, client complaints, and missed opportunities. She researched competitors, analyzed market trends, and developed detailed plans for how a construction company could thrive in the modern economy. She studied Kowalski Sons' financial records, which weren't difficult to access since Brandon regularly brought work home and left documents scattered across their kitchen table. The picture that emerged was both predictable and alarming. Kowalski Sons was profitable, but barely. Their profit margins had been declining for 3 years straight. They were losing bids to smaller, more agile competitors who could offer faster timelines and better communication. Their client base was aging, along with Robert, and they weren't attracting the kind of customers who would drive growth in the coming decade. More troubling was what Diana discovered about the company's internal dynamics. Trevor was a competent manager but lacked vision for adaptation. Robert's influence, while historically valuable, was becoming a barrier to necessary changes. Brandon was caught in the middle, unwilling to challenge family traditions, but aware enough to see that something needed to change. The result was a company stuck in neutral while the industry evolved around them. During her shifts at Mountain Brew, Diana also began networking in ways that her husband's family never imagined. She struck up conversations with local developers, architects, and small business owners who were frustrated with the limited options for construction services in Cedar Falls. She learned about projects that Kowalski and Sons had never even heard about because they weren't connected to the right networks. She discovered opportunities for specialization and innovation that could transform a traditional construction company into a modern, profitable enterprise. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Patricia Hendricks, a successful businesswoman who'd recently relocated from Seattle to oversee a major commercial development project. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia had been complaining about the difficulty of finding local contractors who understood modern project management when Diana had quietly mentioned her background in tech project coordination. "Wait," Patricia had said, setting down her coffee and studying Diana with new interest. "You're telling me you managed software implementations worth millions of dollars, and now you're working in a coffee shop?" Diana had smiled ruefully. "It's a long story." Patricia had leaned forward. "I've got time. And I have a feeling this story might be more interesting than you think." That conversation had lasted 3 hours and changed Diana's perspective on everything. Patricia didn't just listen to Diana's ideas about modernizing construction management. She challenged them, refined them, and helped Diana see possibilities she hadn't considered. More importantly, Patricia had connections throughout the Pacific Northwest's development community and first-hand knowledge of what modern construction clients actually wanted. "You know what your problem is?" Patricia had said as their conversation wound down. "You're trying to change a system from the inside when you have no authority to make changes. Meanwhile, you're sitting on expertise that could revolutionize this entire market." Diana had nodded, though she wasn't sure where Patricia was heading. What if instead of trying to convince them to change, you created the change yourself? The idea had been planted, but it took several more months for Diana to fully understand what Patricia was suggesting. During that time, she continued working at Mountain Brew, continued documenting Kowalski and Sons' missed opportunities, and continued being dismissed by her husband's family as someone who meant well but didn't understand real business. The comments became more frequent and more cutting. Trevor had started referring to her as the consultant in a tone that made it clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. Brandon had begun actively discouraging her from attending family business discussions, suggesting she might be more comfortable watching television or reading in another room. Robert had stopped asking about her work entirely, treating her like a friendly but irrelevant presence at family gatherings. The final straw had come during a particularly frustrating family dinner, where Diana had mentioned a conversation with a potential client who was interested in sustainable building practices. "Sustainable building," Trevor had snorted. "That's just expensive materials with fancy names. Our clients want quality construction at fair prices, not environmental virtue signaling." Brandon had chimed in with his own dismissive comment about trends that would pass once people realized they didn't want to pay premium prices for marginal benefits. Diana had excused herself from dinner early that night, claiming a headache. But instead of going home, she'd driven to Mountain Brew and spent the evening researching sustainable construction practices, market demand, and profit potential. What she'd discovered had made her realize that the Kowalski family wasn't just resistant to change. They were actively blind to opportunities that could transform their business and their community. That's when Patricia's suggestion had finally clicked into place. Diana didn't need to convince the Kowalski family to change. She needed to create an alternative that demonstrated how construction should work in the 21st century. And she knew exactly how to do it. The plan that formed in Diana's mind over the following weeks was audacious, risky, and perfectly suited to her skills and resources. She would acquire Kowalski Sons, not through confrontation or hostile takeover, but through careful positioning and strategic patience. She would use their dismissal of her as cover while she built the financial and professional network necessary to make such an acquisition possible. The irony was delicious. While Brandon and Trevor treated her like she was extinct, she would be quietly building the future of their industry. While they assumed she understood nothing about real business, she would be demonstrating exactly what real business looked like when it was executed with modern tools and strategic thinking. Diana's notebooks multiplied as she refined her plan. She researched business acquisition strategies, analyzed Kowalski Sons' financial vulnerabilities, and identified the key relationships she would need to build. She expanded her network through Mountain Brew, connecting with investors, potential partners, and industry professionals who shared her vision for what construction could become. Most importantly, she began building the financial foundation for her plan. Using her project management skills, she started taking on freelance consulting work for small businesses in Cedar Falls, helping them optimize their operations and improve their profitability. The income was modest but steady, and more importantly, it demonstrated her ability to create value for other business owners. She also began developing relationships with local financial institutions, particularly Patricia's contacts at Cedar Falls Community Bank. These conversations weren't explicitly about acquiring Kowalski Sons, but they established Diana as a serious business professional with legitimate expertise and realistic growth plans. The most challenging aspect of her preparation was maintaining the facade of the dismissed housewife while building the foundation for one of the most significant business acquisitions in Cedar Falls history. She had to be invisible enough that Brandon and his family didn't suspect anything while being visible enough to the business community that her eventual emergence wouldn't seem to come from nowhere. Diana walked a careful line, using her position at Mountain Brew to build relationships while allowing her husband's family to continue, assuming she was simply occupying herself with menial work. She attended local business networking events as a coffee shop employee rather than as Brandon Kowalski's wife, which gave her access to conversations and opportunities that would have been impossible under her married identity. The strategy worked better than she'd hoped. The Cedar Falls business community began to know Diana Walsh as a sharp, insightful professional who understood both traditional business fundamentals and modern operational strategies. Meanwhile, the Kowalski family continued to see her as Brandon's well-meaning but irrelevant wife who had finally stopped bothering them with impractical suggestions. 3 years into her preparation, Diana had assembled everything she needed for her acquisition plan. She had detailed financial analysis of Kowalski Sons operations, including their vulnerabilities and growth potential. She had identified key employees who would be essential to a successful transition. She had built relationships with suppliers, subcontractors, and potential clients who were eager to work with a more modern construction company. Most importantly, she had secured the financial backing necessary to make a competitive acquisition offer. The morning Brandon had called her extinct to his brother, Diana had been reviewing the final documents for her acquisition proposal. In a few hours, she would walk into Cedar Falls Community Bank and formalize an offer that would fundamentally change not just her life, but the entire construction industry in their community. As she stood in that marble lobby, folder in hand, Diana allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They'd wanted her to be invisible, and she'd used that invisibility to build something they couldn't have imagined. They'd dismissed her expertise, and she'd used that expertise to identify opportunities they'd been too proud to see. In a few minutes, she would sit down with Patricia Hendricks and the bank's acquisition team, to discuss the purchase of Kowalski Sons Construction. The woman Brandon thought was extinct was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one you never see coming. The acquisition meeting at Cedar Falls Community Bank lasted 4 hours and changed everything Diana thought she knew about business warfare. Patricia Hendricks had arrived with a briefcase full of documents and a confidence that radiated from her perfectly tailored blazer to her firm handshake with Bank President Marcus Chen. What Diana hadn't expected was how seamlessly her 3 years of careful observation would translate into a comprehensive business strategy that impressed even the most skeptical financial analysts. "Mrs. Walsh," Marcus had said, studying the financial projections Diana had prepared, "these numbers suggest you've been tracking Kowalski Sons' performance with remarkable precision. May I ask how you obtained such detailed operational data?" Diana had smiled, remembering all those evenings when Brandon had spread work documents across their kitchen table, discussing projects and problems with the casual assumption that his wife wasn't really listening. "I've been very attentive to my husband's work," she'd replied, which was technically true while being strategically incomplete. Living with someone in the construction industry teaches you quite a bit about operational challenges and market dynamics. What she didn't mention was the dozens of notebooks filled with overheard conversations, documented complaints from subcontractors, and detailed analysis of every project timeline and budget variance that had crossed their dining room table. Patricia had handled the more complex financial discussions, explaining how Diana's acquisition plan would address specific market inefficiencies that traditional construction companies couldn't or wouldn't tackle. The beauty of their proposal wasn't just in the numbers, though those were compelling enough. It was in the comprehensive understanding of how a construction business should operate in an economy where clients expected transparency, efficiency, and technological integration. The current ownership has been resistant to modernization, Patricia had explained to the bank's loan committee, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd successfully managed similar transitions in multiple industries. Mrs. Walsh's approach represents not just an acquisition, but a complete operational transformation that will position the company for sustained growth in evolving market conditions. Diana had watched the faces around the conference table as Patricia outlined their strategy. These weren't just bankers evaluating a loan application. They were Cedar Falls business leaders who'd watched Kowalski Sons struggle with declining competitiveness for years. They understood the local market dynamics, the missed opportunities, and the growing frustration among clients who wanted more modern service approaches. The breakthrough moment had come when Elena Rodriguez, the bank's commercial lending director, had asked about Diana's plans for retaining existing employees during the transition. Diana's response had clearly surprised everyone in the room, including Patricia. "The employees aren't the problem," Diana had said, pulling out another notebook filled with detailed observations about individual workers and their capabilities. "They're talented professionals who've been constrained by outdated systems and resistant management. Given proper tools and clear communication, most of them would thrive under different leadership." She'd proceeded to outline specific plans for individual employees, demonstrating knowledge of their skills, frustrations, and potential that went far beyond what any external analyst could have developed. Take James Morrison, their senior foreman. He's been suggesting efficiency improvements for 2 years, but his ideas get dismissed because they involve technology integration. Under new management, James could become a team leader who drives innovation rather than someone who's constantly fighting against institutional resistance. The room had gone quiet as Diana continued describing employee capabilities and development potential with the precision of someone who'd been studying human resources dynamics for years. She knew which workers were planning to leave Kowalski Sons due to frustration with management. She understood which team members had skills that were being underutilized. Most importantly, she'd identified the cultural changes necessary to transform a group of talented but demoralized employees into a cohesive, motivated workforce. Marcus Chun had leaned back in his chair, studying Diana with obvious reassessment. "Mrs. Walsh, your analysis suggests you've been conducting an informal organizational assessment for quite some time. This level of insight typically requires months of internal access and detailed observation." Diana had nodded calmly. "I've had plenty of opportunity to observe, Mr. Chun. Sometimes being invisible provides the best vantage point for understanding how an organization really functions." The financial terms of the acquisition had been complex but achievable. Diana would purchase Kowalski Sons through a combination of personal investment, bank financing, and a creative partnership structure with Patricia's development company. The arrangement would provide immediate capital for operational improvements while ensuring long-term financial stability. More importantly, it would allow Diana to implement changes without the lengthy approval processes that had paralyzed the company under family ownership. Walking out of the bank that afternoon, Diana had felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. In 6 weeks, she would own the company that had been dismissing her expertise for 3 years. She would be responsible for the livelihoods of 23 employees, the completion of ongoing projects worth over $2 million, and the transformation of a traditional business model into something capable of thriving in a competitive, modern market. But first, she had to continue playing the role of the irrelevant housewife while secretly preparing for the most dramatic business transition Cedar Falls had seen in decades. The following weeks required a level of strategic deception that exhausted Diana both emotionally and physically. During the day, she maintained her routine at Mountain Brew, serving coffee and listening to conversations while secretly coordinating with Patricia on acquisition details. Evenings were spent at home with Brandon, nodding sympathetically as he complained about work challenges that she already understood better than he did, while privately planning solutions he couldn't imagine. The cognitive dissonance became particularly intense during family dinners at the Kowalski compound. Robert would hold forth about the construction industry with the confidence of someone whose experience was unquestioned, making observations that Diana's research had already proven outdated or incorrect. Trevor would dismiss new market trends with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never seriously analyzed competitive threats. Brandon would agree with both of them while privately expressing frustrations that revealed his growing awareness that something fundamental needed to change. "Clients today have unrealistic expectations," Robert had declared during one particularly frustrating Sunday dinner. "They want everything faster, cheaper, and with constant updates about progress. Back in my day, we gave someone a completion date, and they trusted us to deliver. Now everyone thinks they need daily reports and photo updates." Diana had smiled and asked for more potatoes while mentally noting another operational improvement she would implement immediately after acquisition. Trevor had been even more revealing in his complaints about modern business practices. "These new companies coming into the market, they're all flash and no substance. They promise things they can't deliver just to win bids, then figure out how to make it work later. That's not how you build a sustainable business." What Trevor didn't understand was that his competitors weren't making impossible promises. They were using technology and efficient processes to deliver services that seemed impossible to a company still operating with paper schedules and verbal communication. The most painful moments came when Brandon would express genuine frustration about their company's challenges while simultaneously dismissing the expertise that could solve them. "I know we need to change something," he'd confided to Diana one evening after a particularly difficult day dealing with an angry client. "We're losing jobs to companies that honestly don't seem more qualified than we are. There's something we're not seeing, some approach we're missing." Diana had listened, supportively, offering gentle suggestions that Brandon either ignored or deflected. The irony was devastating. Her husband was genuinely struggling with problems she'd already solved, but he was so committed to the narrative of her irrelevance that he couldn't recognize the solutions sitting right in front of him. During this period, Diana also began developing relationships with key Kowalski and Sons employees, though they had no idea who she really was or what she was planning. Her position at Mountain Brew provided natural opportunities to interact with workers who stopped by for coffee before or after shifts. These conversations, seemingly casual and friendly, allowed Diana to understand workplace dynamics from the perspective of people who actually performed the daily work. James Morrison, the senior foreman Brandon had mentioned in passing, turned out to be a thoughtful professional who'd been quietly documenting inefficiencies and developing improvement strategies that management had never seriously considered. The thing is, James had told Diana during one of their coffee conversations, we could be doing twice as much work with the same crew if we just organized things differently. But every time someone suggests a change, the answer is always, that's not how we do things here. Diana had listened carefully as James outlined ideas for scheduling optimization, communication improvements, and technology integration that aligned perfectly with her own modernization plans. She learned that several employees had been discussing the possibility of starting their own construction company because they were frustrated with Kowalski and Sons' resistance to innovation. More importantly, she discovered that the workforce was far more capable and forward-thinking than management realized. Mr. Robert is a good man, James had explained, and Trevor knows construction inside and out, but they're stuck in the past. Meanwhile, we're out there every day dealing with clients who expect things the old system can't deliver. It's getting harder and harder to make excuses for why we can't provide the kind of service that other companies offer as standard practice. These conversations provided Diana with invaluable insight into the human dynamic she would need to manage during the transition. The employees weren't resistant to change. They were hungry for it. They weren't lacking in skills or motivation. They were constrained by leadership that couldn't adapt to evolving market demands. With proper management and modern tools, the existing workforce could become a significant competitive advantage rather than a collection of individuals frustrated by systemic limitations. Diana also used her time at Mountain Brew to develop relationships with suppliers, subcontractors, and potential clients who could become crucial partners during her transformation of Kowalski and Sons. These networking opportunities, which would have been impossible in her role as Brandon's wife, allowed her to understand the broader ecosystem of business relationships that would determine her success or failure. One particularly valuable connection was with Lisa Montgomery, who managed commercial accounts for a major building supply company. Lisa had worked with Kowalski and Sons for over a decade and had watched their purchasing patterns become increasingly erratic and inefficient. They order materials like they're still running a company from the 1980s, Lisa had confided during one of their conversations. No inventory management, no bulk purchasing strategies, no integration with project timelines. We keep suggesting improvements, but they seem to think efficiency is somehow incompatible with quality. Through Lisa, Diana learned about supplier relationships that could be optimized to reduce costs and improve project timelines. She discovered volume discount opportunities that Kowalski and Sons had never pursued. Most importantly, she understood how vendor partnerships could be structured to support the kind of integrated project management approach that modern clients expected. These insights became part of Diana's comprehensive transformation plan, which grew more detailed and ambitious as her acquisition date approached. She wasn't just buying a construction company. She was preparing to demonstrate how traditional craftsmanship could be enhanced rather than replaced by modern business practices. Her plan addressed everything from employee development and technology, integration to client communication and financial management. The plan also included specific strategies for managing the inevitable resistance from Robert and Trevor. Diana understood that they would view any changes as criticisms of their leadership and threats to their legacy. Her approach would need to balance respect for their experience with clear demonstration of improved results. She would implement changes gradually, allowing the family to see positive outcomes before introducing more dramatic modifications. Most importantly, Diana's plan addressed the emotional and psychological aspects of business transformation. She understood that changing a family business wasn't just about improving operations. It was about helping people adapt their identities and expectations to new realities. Her success would depend not just on implementing better systems, but on helping everyone involved see those improvements as enhancements rather than replacements of everything they'd built. As the acquisition date approached, Diana found herself living in an increasingly surreal situation. At home, she was the dismissed wife whose business suggestions had finally stopped because she'd learned her place. At Mountain Brew, she was the friendly coffee shop employee who happened to have interesting insights about local business dynamics. In her private conversations with Patricia and the bank team, she was the visionary entrepreneur preparing to revolutionize Cedar Falls' construction industry. The strain of maintaining these multiple identities while preparing for such a significant transition began affecting Diana in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found herself rehearsing conversations, planning responses to questions that hadn't been asked, and lying awake at night imagining how Brandon and his family would react when they discovered what she'd been planning. The most difficult aspect wasn't the deception itself, but the growing realization of how completely her husband's family had misjudged her capabilities and intentions. Their dismissal of her expertise hadn't been based on careful evaluation of her ideas. It had been based on assumptions about her role and relevance that they'd never bothered to question. The depth of their blindness to her actual abilities was both insulting and strategically useful. 2 weeks before the acquisition was scheduled to close, Diana received unexpected news that would complicate everything she'd planned. Patricia called her at Mountain Brew with information that changed the entire timeline and stakes of their strategy. "Diana," Patricia had said, her voice unusually tense, "we need to meet tonight. Something's happened that affects our acquisition plan, and we need to decide how to respond." Diana's heart had started racing as she considered the possibilities. Had someone discovered their plan? Had the financing fallen through? Had Kowalski Sons received another acquisition offer? That evening, meeting in Patricia's temporary office at the development site, Diana learned that the situation was both better and worse than anything she'd imagined. Robert Kowalski had suffered a minor heart attack the previous day and was being pressured by his doctors to reduce his stress and involvement in daily business operations. Trevor was panicking about the increased responsibility and had begun discussing the possibility of selling the company to a larger construction firm that could provide management expertise and financial stability. "They're considering offers," Patricia had explained, spreading documents across her desk. Trevor's already had preliminary conversations with 2 regional companies that specialize in acquiring family businesses. If they move forward, our opportunity disappears, and Kowalski Sons becomes a subsidiary of some corporation that will probably eliminate most of the local jobs. Diana had stared at the documents, realizing that her careful 3-year plan might be derailed by circumstances completely outside her control. Everything she'd prepared for, all the relationships she'd built, the comprehensive transformation strategy she'd developed, could become irrelevant if Trevor decided to sell to an external buyer who could offer immediate cash and corporate backing. But as she'd studied the situation, Diana had also recognized an opportunity that could accelerate everything she'd been planning. If the Kowalski family was actively considering selling, her acquisition offer would no longer seem impossible or presumptuous. Instead, it would represent a local alternative to corporate absorption, a way to preserve jobs and community connections, while still providing the financial security and professional management that Robert's health crisis had made necessary. "How much time do we have?" Diana had asked, her mind already racing through the implications and possibilities. Patricia had checked her watch. Trevor's meeting with the first corporate buyer on Friday. We need to present our offer before then, which gives us less than a week to finalize everything. Walking home that night, Diana had realized that her moment of truth was arriving faster and more dramatically than she'd anticipated. In a few days, she would have to reveal her plans to Brandon and his family, not as a gradual process she could manage carefully, but as an urgent alternative to losing their family business entirely. The woman they thought was extinct was about to emerge from 3 years of careful preparation to offer them salvation they didn't know they needed. Diana Walsh stood in her kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, staring at the coffee maker while rehearsing words she'd never imagined saying to her husband. In 3 hours, she would walk into the emergency family meeting that Trevor had called to discuss their father's condition and the future of Kowalski and Sons. In 4 hours, she would transform from Brandon's invisible wife into a serious acquisition candidate with financing, partnerships, and a comprehensive business plan that could save the company they were considering selling to strangers. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on her. After 3 years of careful preparation and strategic patience, circumstances had accelerated everything into a single, high-stakes confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the family business, but the future of her marriage and her place in Cedar Falls. She'd planned for a gradual revelation of her capabilities, a measured demonstration of her business expertise. Instead, she would be walking into a room full of desperate people with solutions they hadn't known existed. Brandon emerged from their bedroom looking haggard and worried, his usual confidence replaced by the uncertainty of someone facing challenges he didn't understand how to handle. "Dad looked so frail yesterday," he said, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly. "Trevor's talking about selling to that Portland company, but I can't imagine strangers running our family business. 3 generations, Diana. 70 years of building something, and it might all disappear because we can't figure out how to make it work anymore." Diana watched her husband struggle with emotions and decisions that she'd been preparing to address for months. The man who dismissed her business insights was now drowning in exactly the problems she'd been analyzing and solving in her notebooks. She felt a mixture of sympathy and frustration that made her chest tight. "Maybe there are options you haven't considered," she said carefully, testing the waters for what was coming. Brandon laughed bitterly. "What options?" "Trevor's spent the last 6 months trying to figure out how to turn things around, and all he's managed to do is prove that we're in over our heads. The construction industry has changed, and we're still operating like it's 1995. We need professional management, modern systems, people who understand how to compete in today's market. All things we don't have and can't afford to develop." The opening was perfect, almost scripted. Diana set down her coffee cup and turned to face her husband directly. "What if I told you that all of those things already exist? That someone has been developing exactly the kind of comprehensive solution your family needs, and that person is ready to present a complete acquisition plan that would preserve jobs, maintain family connections, and transform the business into something profitable and sustainable?" Brandon stared at her with the expression of someone who wasn't quite following the conversation. "I'd say that sounds too good to be true. Who would want to take on a struggling construction company in a small town? And even if someone did, how would we know they weren't just planning to strip the assets and eliminate the local jobs?" Diana took a deep breath, realizing there was no gentle way to deliver the information that would shatter every assumption her husband had about her capabilities and intentions. "Brandon, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to understand, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the moment, because Brandon immediately took a seat at their kitchen table, his expression shifting from confused to concerned. Diana remained standing, drawing strength from the 3 years of preparation that had led to this moment. For the past 3 years, while your family has been treating me like someone whose opinions don't matter, I've been conducting a comprehensive analysis of Kowalski and Sons operations, market position, and growth potential. I've documented every inefficiency, every missed opportunity, and every competitive disadvantage that has been driving your declining profitability. I've also developed detailed solutions for all of those problems, including implementation strategies, financial projections, and partnership structures that would ensure successful transformation. Brandon's expression shifted from concern to confusion. Diana, I appreciate that you want to help, but analysis and solutions are different things. This isn't a project management problem you can solve with better organization. Diana pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph of the conference room at Cedar Falls Community Bank, taken the day of her acquisition meeting. I'm not offering help, Brandon. I'm offering ownership. The silence that followed stretched until Diana began to wonder if her husband had understood what she'd said. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What do you mean, ownership? Diana walked to their home office and returned with a folder containing copies of all the documentation from her acquisition proposal. She spread the papers across their kitchen table, the same table where Brandon had unknowingly provided her with access to Kowalski and Sons' internal information for 3 years. I mean that I have secured financing, developed partnerships, and prepared a comprehensive acquisition offer for Kowalski and Sons Construction. The offer includes immediate capital for operational improvements, guaranteed job security for all current employees, and a transformation plan that would position the company as the leading construction firm in the region within 18 months. Brandon picked up the bank documents with trembling hands, scanning pages of financial projections and legal frameworks that clearly demonstrated the seriousness and sophistication of Diana's planning. This is impossible, he said, though. His voice lacked conviction. You work at a coffee shop. You don't have access to this kind of capital or business expertise. How could you possibly have developed something this comprehensive without anyone knowing? Diana sat down across from him, finally able to speak with complete honesty about everything she'd been building in secret. I work at Mountain Brew because it gave me access to every important conversation in Cedar Falls business community. I've been networking with developers, suppliers, contractors, and financial professionals for 3 years, building relationships and expertise while your family assumed I was just keeping myself busy with meaningless work. The coffee shop wasn't my career, Brandon. It was my research laboratory. She watched her husband's face cycle through emotions as he processed information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about her life and capabilities. The woman you've all been dismissing as extinct has been preparing to save your family business while you've been struggling to understand what's wrong with it. Brandon set down the documents and stared at her with an expression she'd never seen before. It wasn't quite recognition, but it wasn't dismissal either. For the first time in their marriage, he was looking at her as someone whose capabilities he might have fundamentally misjudged. Diana, even if everything you're saying is true, even if you somehow developed legitimate business expertise and financial backing, this would mean that you've been lying to me for 3 years. You've been pretending to be someone you're not, planning something this significant without involving me, operating in complete secrecy while living in our house and sharing our bed. The hurt in his voice was genuine, and Diana felt the full weight of what her necessary deception had cost their relationship. I've been protecting myself, Brandon. Every time I tried to contribute ideas or suggestions, your family made it clear that my input wasn't welcome. Every time I demonstrated knowledge or expertise, I was told to stick to things I understood. I didn't choose deception. I chose survival. If your family had been willing to take me seriously 3 years ago, none of this secrecy would have been necessary. Brandon stood up and walked to their kitchen window. staring out at the neighborhood they'd shared while she'd been planning a transformation he'd never imagined. So what happens now? You walk into this morning's meeting and announce that you're buying our family business? You think my father and Trevor are going to accept that the woman they've been dismissing as irrelevant is suddenly their salvation? Diana joined him at the window, seeing their familiar street with new eyes. I think your father and Trevor are desperate enough to consider any legitimate alternative to selling to strangers. I think they're smart enough to recognize that keeping the business in local hands, even if those hands belong to someone they underestimated, is better than watching it become a corporate subsidiary. Most importantly, I think the numbers and business plan will speak for themselves, regardless of their personal opinions about my qualifications. What Diana didn't say was that she'd spent 3 years preparing for exactly the kind of resistance and skepticism that Brandon was expressing. She understood that convincing the Kowalski family to take her seriously would require more than just presenting superior analysis and financial backing. It would require demonstrating results they couldn't achieve themselves, solving problems they couldn't solve, and proving that her approach could succeed where their traditional methods had failed. The drive to the Kowalski compound was silent, except for the sound of Brandon's fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. Diana used the time to review her presentation strategy one final time, knowing that she would have perhaps 30 minutes to present 3 years of work in a way that desperate people could understand and accept. The challenge wasn't just in the complexity of her business plan. It was in overcoming years of established assumptions about her role and relevance. Trevor's car was already in the driveway when they arrived, along with Robert's old pickup truck, which meant that despite his recent health scare, the patriarch was planning to participate in discussions about the company's future. Diana took this as a positive sign. If Robert was present, she would have the opportunity to address his concerns directly, rather than having her proposal filtered through Trevor's interpretation and bias. Walking into the house where she'd endured years of polite dismissal, Diana felt a strange combination of nervousness and confidence. She was finally bringing her real self to a place where she'd been forced to pretend irrelevance for so long. The dining room where she'd presented her first unsuccessful analysis 3 years ago would now be the setting for a comprehensive solution that could save everything the family had built. Robert looked frailer than Diana had ever seen him, but his eyes were still sharp with the intelligence that had built a successful business from nothing. Trevor appeared stressed and exhausted, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that clearly illustrated the company's precarious position. The sight of their desperation made Diana feel both sympathetic and vindicated. These were good people who'd been trapped by their own limitations and assumptions. "Diana," Robert said with surprise, "I didn't expect to see you at this meeting. Trevor and I need to discuss some complicated business matters." The automatic assumption that she wouldn't be interested or capable of understanding complex discussions was so familiar that Diana almost smiled. In a few minutes, these same men would be evaluating her as a serious acquisition candidate with solutions they desperately needed. "Actually, Dad," Brandon said, his voice carrying an uncertainty that immediately caught everyone's attention, "Diana has something to present that might be relevant to your discussions." Trevor looked up from his paperwork with visible irritation. "Brandon, this really isn't the time for Diana's suggestions. We're facing serious decisions about the future of our company, and we need to focus on realistic options." Diana stepped forward before Brandon could respond, pulling out her own folder of documents and setting them on the dining room table with quiet confidence. "Trevor, you're absolutely right that this is serious, and you're absolutely right that you need realistic options. What you don't know is that I've spent 3 years developing exactly the kind of realistic option you need, and I'm here to present a comprehensive acquisition proposal that could solve every problem you're facing." The room went completely silent except for the sound of Robert's labored breathing and the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Trevor stared at Diana as if she'd started speaking a foreign language, while Robert's expression shifted from surprise to confused attention. Diana used their shock to her advantage, spreading her documents across the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this presentation dozens of times. "Gentlemen, what you're looking at is a complete business acquisition. Proposal for Kowalski Sons Construction, including immediate financing, operational transformation plans, employee retention guarantees, and projected profitability that exceeds your historical performance by 40% within the first 18 months. Trevor recovered from his surprise first, but his response was exactly what Diana had expected. "Diana, I appreciate whatever effort you've put into this, but acquisition proposals require serious financial backing and professional expertise. This isn't something you can research at the library and present as a legitimate business plan." Robert held up a hand to silence his son, studying the documents Diana had spread before them with the careful attention of someone who'd evaluated countless proposals over 7 decades in business. "Trevor, let her finish," Robert said quietly. "I want to understand what she's proposing before we dismiss it." Diana felt a surge of gratitude toward the old man, recognizing that his willingness to listen might be the only thing standing between her presentation and immediate rejection. She began walking them through her analysis, starting with the comprehensive assessment of their current situation that demonstrated her deep understanding of their operational challenges. "Your company is losing market share because you're competing on traditional strengths in a market that values different capabilities," Diana began, pulling out charts that illustrated declining bid success rates and customer retention problems. "Clients today expect integrated project management, transparent communication, and technology-supported service delivery. Your current systems can't provide these things, which means you're automatically eliminated from consideration for the most profitable projects." Trevor's face was reddening as Diana continued her presentation, but Robert was leaning forward with obvious interest, asking detailed questions about her methodology and conclusions. "Diana, these numbers suggest you've had access to our internal financial records and operational data. How did you obtain this level of detailed information about our business performance?" Diana glanced at Brandon, who was staring at the table as if he could disappear through sheer willpower. "Mr. Robert, I've been married to your son for 8 years and living in this community for just as long. Brandon regularly brought work home, discussed challenges and projects at family dinners, and never imagined that I was paying attention in any systematic way. Meanwhile, my position at Mountain Brew gave me access to conversations with your employees, suppliers, and competitors. I've been inadvertently conducting market research for 3 years. What followed was the most intense business discussion Diana had ever experienced. Robert and Trevor peppered her with questions about everything from cash flow projections to employee management strategies, clearly testing whether her presentation represented genuine expertise or elaborate guesswork. Diana answered every question with specific data, detailed analysis, and practical solutions that demonstrated not just theoretical knowledge, but deep understanding of implementation challenges. The breakthrough came when Robert asked about her plans for preserving the company's reputation and client relationships during a transition period. Diana's response revealed the extent of her preparation and the sophistication of her strategic thinking. "Mr. Robert, your reputation is built on quality craftsmanship and reliable completion of projects. Those strengths don't disappear under new management. They get enhanced by better systems and communication. I've already had preliminary conversations with your key clients about service improvements they'd like to see, and I've identified specific changes that would increase their satisfaction and loyalty." Trevor finally exploded with the frustration he'd been suppressing throughout the presentation. "This is insane. Diana, you're a housewife who works part-time at a coffee shop. Suddenly you're an expert on construction management and business acquisition. You expect us to believe you've developed professional-level solutions to problems that industry veterans struggle with? Where did you get the expertise? Where did you get the financing? Who are your partners, and why should we trust them with our family business? Diana had been waiting for this moment, the inevitable challenge to her credibility that would determine whether her presentation succeeded or failed. She pulled out her final folder, containing letters of recommendation from business leaders throughout the Pacific Northwest, detailed financial commitments from Cedar Falls Community Bank, and partnership agreements with established development companies that provided both credibility and ongoing support. Trevor, my expertise comes from 15 years of project management and technology implementation, 3 years of intensive study of your industry and local market, and partnerships with professionals who've successfully managed business transitions throughout the region. My financing comes from a combination of personal investment, bank lending based on comprehensive business projections, and strategic partnerships that provide both capital and ongoing expertise. She handed him a letter from Patricia Hendricks, whose signature carried weight throughout the regional development community. As for trust, you don't have to trust me. You have to trust the numbers, the references, and the fact that my success depends on preserving everything valuable about Kowalski Sons while adding the capabilities necessary for future growth. Robert had been quiet during Trevor's outburst, studying the partnership agreements and financial documents with obvious amazement. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that immediately focused everyone's attention. Diana, assuming everything you've presented is legitimate, and assuming you can deliver on these projections, what happens to our family's connection to the business? What happens to Trevor's role, to the Kowalski name, to the legacy we've spent 70 years building? Diana's answer to this question would determine everything, and she knew it. Mr. Robert, I'm not proposing to eliminate your family's connection to the business. I'm proposing to preserve it by ensuring the business survives and thrives. Trevor would remain as operations manager, with enhanced authority and better tools to succeed. The Kowalski name would continue as the company identity, honoring the foundation you built while adapting to serve future generations. Your legacy wouldn't disappear. It would evolve into something sustainable and profitable. The room fell silent as the 3 men processed everything Diana had presented. She could see them struggling to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the professional who just delivered the most comprehensive business analysis they'd ever experienced. The assumptions they'd held about her capabilities and intentions were crumbling in real time, replaced by the undeniable evidence of expertise they'd refused to recognize. Finally, Robert Kowalski looked directly at Diana Walsh and asked the question that would change everything. When can you start? The emergency that would test everything Diana had promised came exactly 6 days after she signed the acquisition papers for Kowalski Sons Construction. She was in her new office, still adjusting to the surreal experience of sitting behind the desk where Trevor had dismissed her ideas for 3 years, when her phone rang with the kind of call that separates theoretical business plans from real-world leadership. Mrs. Walsh, this is James Morrison calling from the Riverside development site. We have a serious problem that needs immediate attention. Diana's pulse quickened as she recognized the voice of the senior foreman who'd become one of her first allies in the company transition. James wasn't someone who panicked easily, which meant whatever was happening at Riverside was genuinely critical. Tell me what's going on, James. Diana grabbed her notebook and pen, already shifting into the crisis management mode that had served her well during her technology project days. The Riverside development was their largest active contract, a mixed-use commercial project worth over $800,000 with completion deadlines that would determine Kowalski Sons' reputation for the next decade. The concrete pour we started yesterday morning has failed completely. The entire foundation for Building C is compromised, and the structural engineer is saying we need to tear it out and start over. The client is threatening to terminate our contract and hire someone else to finish the job. They're talking about lawsuits, penalty clauses, and basically everything that could destroy our reputation in this town. Diana felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications. A failed concrete pour on this scale wasn't just a technical problem. It was the kind of disaster that could bankrupt a construction company if handled incorrectly. More importantly, it was exactly the kind of crisis that would validate every doubt about her ability to manage a business she'd supposedly never understood. "James, I need you to secure the site and document everything before anyone touches anything. Take photographs of the failed pour from multiple angles, collect samples if the engineer thinks it's safe, and get written statements from everyone who was involved in the original work. Most importantly, don't let anyone from the client's team make any decisions about remediation until I get there." Diana grabbed her jacket and keys, already calculating the multiple levels of crisis management this situation would require. The technical aspects of determining what went wrong and how to fix it were complicated but solvable. The financial implications of absorbing the cost of remediation while protecting their profit margins required careful analysis and strategic negotiation. The relationship management necessary to preserve their partnership with a major developer, who was understandably furious, would test every business skill she'd developed over the past 15 years. But the most challenging aspect of this crisis was that it was happening during her first week as owner of Kowalski Sons, when everyone from employees to clients to the broader Cedar Falls business community was watching to see whether the woman who'd bought a family construction company actually knew how to run one. The drive to the Riverside site gave Diana 20 minutes to develop a comprehensive response strategy while dealing with the emotional reality that her business ownership had just collided with the kind of high-stakes problem that could prove or disprove everything she'd claimed about her capabilities. She called Patricia Hendricks first, knowing she would need someone with deep development experience to help navigate the client relationship aspects of the crisis. "Patricia, I need your expertise on a situation that could determine whether my acquisition succeeds or fails spectacularly." Diana outlined the concrete failure while driving, already appreciating how much clearer her thinking became when she could focus on solving problems rather than hiding her capabilities. Patricia's response was immediate and practical. "Diana, concrete failures on that scale are usually caused by either material problems, environmental conditions, or procedural errors during the pour. The good news is that all of those causes have solutions, and experienced developers understand that construction involves managing risks rather than avoiding them entirely. The key is responding with competence and transparency rather than panic and blame shifting." Patricia agreed to meet Diana at the site, bringing her own structural engineer and a materials specialist who could help determine the root cause of the failure. More importantly, she offered to facilitate conversations with the client based on her relationships in the regional development community. "Diana, this is exactly the kind of crisis that separates real construction managers from people who just talk a good game. Show them you can solve problems under pressure, and you'll earn more credibility than months of smooth operations could provide." Arriving at the Riverside site, Diana found a scene that was somehow both better and worse than she'd anticipated. The failed concrete pour was visually dramatic, with obvious cracks and settling that would require complete removal and replacement. But the team assembled around the problem included not just her own employees, but representatives from the client, the original materials supplier, and the structural engineer, all of whom seemed more interested in understanding what went wrong than in assigning blame. James Morrison approached her as she surveyed the scene, his expression mixing professional concern with obvious relief that she'd arrived quickly. "Mrs. Walsh, I've documented everything you requested, and I think we've identified the primary cause of the failure. The concrete supplier delivered a batch that was significantly different from the specifications we ordered. The chemical composition was wrong for the environmental conditions we were dealing with, and it started failing almost immediately after the pour. Diana studied the documentation James had prepared, recognizing the thoroughness and attention to detail that had made him such a valuable employee despite being undervalued by previous management. "James, this is excellent work. Have you shared these findings with the client representatives and the structural engineer?" James nodded toward a group of people examining concrete samples near the failed foundation. "They're all looking at the same evidence, and they're reaching the same conclusions. The supplier has already admitted that they made an error in the batch composition, and they're prepared to cover the costs of remediation. The question now is whether we can manage the removal and replacement in a way that doesn't completely destroy our timeline for the overall project." Diana felt a surge of relief mixed with renewed determination. The crisis was serious but manageable, and her team had responded with exactly the kind of professional competence that would be necessary for long-term success. More importantly, the situation provided an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of transparent, solution-focused leadership that would differentiate her management approach from the defensive, tradition-bound methods that had characterized Kowalski and Sons under previous ownership. Walking toward the group examining the failed concrete, Diana recognized the moment when theoretical business plans meet real-world testing. Everything she'd promised about her ability to manage complex projects, solve unexpected problems, and maintain client relationships was about to be evaluated by people whose judgment would determine her company's future in Cedar Falls Construction. Market. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diana Walsh, the new owner of Kowalski Sons. I understand we have a significant problem that requires immediate attention and coordinated response. The group turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. These were experienced professionals who'd seen plenty of construction managers promise more than they could deliver, and Diana's gender, age, and unfamiliarity to most of them clearly raised questions about her qualifications. Michael Torres, the client's project manager, stepped forward with the aggressive posture of someone preparing for confrontation. "Mrs. Walsh, your company has just caused a delay. That could cost us weeks and thousands of dollars in penalties. We need to understand how this happened, who's responsible for the costs, and what guarantees you can provide that it won't happen again." Diana had encountered similar challenges throughout her technology career, situations where her credibility was questioned and her competence tested by people who needed results more than they needed to feel comfortable with her leadership style. "Mr. Torres, I completely understand your concerns, and I'm here to provide you with comprehensive answers and concrete solutions. Before we discuss responsibility and guarantees, let me show you what we've determined about the cause of this failure and what we're prepared to do about it." She pulled out the documentation James had prepared and began walking the group through a systematic analysis of what had gone wrong, why it had happened, and how similar problems could be prevented in the future. Her presentation was detailed, technical, and completely free of the defensive posturing or blame shifting that often characterized construction crisis management. "The concrete supplier has acknowledged responsibility for delivering material that didn't meet our specifications, and they've agreed to cover all costs associated with removal and replacement. Our timeline for remediation is aggressive but achievable, and we're prepared to add additional crew members to ensure that this delay doesn't cascade into problems with other aspects of the project." What surprised everyone, including Diana herself, was how naturally her technology project management experience translated into construction crisis leadership. The skills she'd developed coordinating complex software implementations, managing multiple stakeholder relationships, and maintaining project timelines under pressure were directly applicable to managing concrete failures, client expectations, and subcontractor coordination. Patricia Hendricks arrived as Diana was outlining her remediation timeline, bringing with her the materials specialist and structural engineer she'd promised. Their presence immediately elevated the credibility of Diana's response, demonstrating that she had access to the kind of professional expertise that major development projects required. Diana's analysis is consistent with what we're seeing, Patricia announced after reviewing the documentation and examining the failed concrete. This was a supplier error, not a management failure, and her proposed remediation approach will actually result in a stronger foundation than the original specifications would have provided. The breakthrough came when Diana proposed a solution that none of the experienced professionals had considered. Instead of simply replacing the failed concrete with identical material, she suggested upgrading the foundation design to exceed the original specifications using the supplier's error as an opportunity to enhance the building's long-term structural integrity. The supplier is already covering the costs of remediation, Diana explained, spreading architectural drawings across a makeshift table. If we're going to tear out the existing foundation anyway, we can implement design improvements that would have been expensive to add later, but are cost-neutral to include now. The result would be a building that's more resistant to seismic activity and thermal expansion than anything else in Cedar Falls. Michael Torres studied her proposal with obvious surprise, clearly not expecting such innovative thinking from a construction manager he'd never heard of until 20 minutes earlier. Mrs. Walsh, this approach would actually improve our building beyond the original specifications. Why would you absorb the additional design and labor costs when the concrete supplier is only responsible for basic remediation? Diana's answer revealed the strategic thinking that would define her approach to business ownership. Mr. Torres, my company's reputation depends on delivering exceptional results, not just meeting minimum standards. This situation gives us an opportunity to demonstrate that working with Kowalski and Sons means getting better outcomes than you originally planned for, even when problems occur. That's the kind of relationship that leads to future partnerships and referrals. The client team exchanged glances that suggested Diana's response had exceeded their expectations in ways they hadn't anticipated. Construction contractors who took responsibility for problems and converted them into value-added opportunities were rare enough to be memorable. More importantly, Diana's approach demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative problem-solving that modern development projects required. What followed was 3 hours of detailed planning that transformed a potential disaster into a demonstration of superior project management. Diana coordinated with the structural engineer to finalize the enhanced foundation design, worked with the materials specialist to specify concrete that would exceed original performance requirements, and collaborated with her own crew to develop a timeline that would complete the improved foundation faster than the original schedule had projected. James Morrison watched the entire process with obvious amazement, clearly recognizing that he was observing a level of project coordination and client management that he'd never experienced during his years with Kowalski and Sons under family ownership. Mrs. Walsh, he said quietly during a break in the planning session, I've worked construction for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone turn a major problem into a competitive advantage like this. The real test came when Brandon and Trevor arrived at the site, having heard about the concrete failure through the Cedar Falls Construction network that carried news faster than local radio. Diana watched her husband and former brother-in-law approach the scene with expressions of concern and barely concealed skepticism about her ability to handle a crisis of this magnitude. Diana, Brandon said, surveying the failed concrete and the assembled team of professionals, this looks serious. Maybe you should call in someone with more experience to help manage the situation. The automatic assumption that she would need assistance was so familiar that Diana felt momentarily transported back to 3 years of being dismissed and underestimated. But the response came not from Diana but from Michael Torres, who'd spent the afternoon watching her demonstrate exactly the kind of competent leadership that construction projects required. "Actually, your wife has been managing this situation better than most contractors I've worked with." Her response has been professional, comprehensive, and innovative. "We're moving forward with an enhanced foundation design that will make this building better than we originally planned." Trevor's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion as he processed the client's endorsement of Diana's crisis management. "Enhanced foundation design? Diana, you've owned the company for less than a week. How could you possibly have developed design modifications for a project this complex?" Diana pulled out the architectural drawings and engineering specifications she'd been working with, spreading them across the table where Brandon and Trevor could examine her work. "Trevor, managing complex projects with multiple stakeholder requirements and technical challenges is exactly what I did for 15 years in technology implementation. Construction projects require the same coordination skills, attention to detail, and ability to adapt quickly when problems arise. The technical expertise comes from partnering with professionals like Patricia's engineering team, but the project management capabilities are directly transferable from my previous experience." What happened next would become legendary in Cedar Falls construction circles. Patricia Hendricks, who'd been observing the family dynamics with obvious interest, addressed Brandon and Trevor directly about Diana's performance. "Gentlemen, I've managed development projects throughout the Pacific Northwest for over 20 years, and I can tell you that your wife has demonstrated exactly the kind of crisis leadership that separates successful contractors from companies that struggle with complex challenges. Her response to this situation has been textbook professional project management." Brandon stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, finally understanding that the woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant possessed capabilities that he'd never bothered to recognize or appreciate. "Diana, I owe you an apology. I've been watching you work for the past 3 hours, and it's clear that you know exactly what you're doing. I'm sorry I doubted your abilities." The concrete crisis concluded with Diana's enhanced foundation design being implemented ahead of schedule and under budget, despite the initial failure that had threatened to derail the entire project. More importantly, the crisis had provided Diana with an opportunity to demonstrate her competence to everyone who mattered: her employees, her clients, her husband's family, and the broader Cedar Falls business community. 3 weeks later, when the upgraded foundation passed final inspection with commendations from the structural engineer, Diana received a call that would validate everything she'd been building toward. Michael Torres was offering Kowalski Sons the general contractor position for Riverside Development's next phase, a project worth over $2 million and large enough to establish her company as the premier construction firm in the region. The woman they'd called extinct had just saved their family business and proven that sometimes the most important innovations come from people who see familiar problems with completely fresh perspectives. 1 year after Diana Walsh purchased Kowalski Sons Construction, she stood in the same conference room where her acquisition proposal had once been met with disbelief. But everything about the space reflected the transformation that had swept through the company. The walls now displayed digital project timelines instead of handwritten schedules. Real-time progress photographs from active job sites replaced static company awards, and the table where family meetings had once devolved into defensive arguments now hosted collaborative planning sessions with clients, architects, and subcontractors. The quarterly review meeting Diana was preparing to lead would demonstrate just how completely her vision had reshaped not only Kowalski Sons but the entire construction landscape in Cedar Falls. Representatives from 3 major development companies, the mayor's office, and 2 architectural firms were gathering to discuss projects that would have been impossible under the company's previous management approach. More significantly, Trevor and Brandon would be presenting their own departmental reports, showcasing expertise and leadership abilities that had flourished once they'd been freed from the limitations of outdated systems, and defensive thinking. Diana reviewed the presentation materials one final time, still amazed by how dramatically the numbers had changed since her acquisition. Revenue had increased by 67%, profit margins had nearly doubled, and employee satisfaction. Surveys revealed workplace morale that exceeded industry standards by significant measures. But the statistics that meant most to Diana were the ones that reflected the company's impact on the broader community. 23 new permanent jobs, partnerships with local suppliers that had strengthened the regional economy, and construction. Projects that were setting new standards for quality and innovation throughout Oregon's Mid-Valley region. The transformation hadn't been immediate or simple. Diana's first 6 months as owner had required navigating resistance from longtime subcontractors who distrusted change, skepticism from clients who wondered if a woman with no traditional construction background could deliver on ambitious promises, and internal tensions as employees adjusted to management approaches that prioritized transparency and collaborative problem-solving over hierarchical authority. The breakthrough had come when Diana implemented the employee development program that she'd outlined in her original acquisition proposal. Instead of treating workers as interchangeable labor, she'd invested in training that enhanced their skills, while giving them genuine authority to make decisions about project implementation. James Morrison had become the company's first certified project coordinator, with responsibility for client communication and timeline management that utilized his natural leadership abilities. Maria Santos, a carpenter who'd been overlooked for advancement under previous management, had developed expertise in sustainable building techniques that positioned Kowalski and Kowalski Sons as the regional leader in environmentally responsible construction. Most remarkably, Trevor Kowalski had emerged as one of Diana's most valuable partners, once he'd overcome his initial resistance to her leadership. The operational knowledge he'd accumulated over 20 years in the family business proved invaluable. When combined with Diana's strategic planning and modern project management systems, Trevor's transformation from defensive traditionalist to innovative department head had become a case study in how established professionals could adapt and thrive when supported rather than constrained by organizational culture. Diana, Trevor said, entering the conference room with the quarterly financial reports she'd requested. These numbers still surprise me every time I review them. 18 months ago, we were struggling to maintain profit margins on projects half this size. Now we're completing complex developments ahead of schedule and under budget while actually increasing our profit per project. I'm still learning how you made this possible. Diana accepted the reports while reflecting on how much her relationship with Trevor had evolved since the day she'd presented her acquisition proposal to a room full of skeptical family members. Trevor, the improvements didn't come from changing what you were doing wrong. They came from providing tools and systems that allowed you to do what you were already good at, but more efficiently and with better communication. Your expertise was never the problem. The problem was working within limitations that prevented you from using that expertise effectively. The observation was more than diplomatic courtesy. Diana had discovered that much of the Kowalski family's resistance to change had stemmed from their assumption that modernization meant abandoning the craftsmanship and attention to detail that had built their reputation. Her approach had instead focused on enhancing those traditional strengths with contemporary tools and communication methods that made superior work more visible and profitable. Brandon entered the conference room carrying the client satisfaction surveys that had become a cornerstone of Diana's quality management system. His transformation over the past year had been perhaps the most dramatic of anyone in the company, as he'd evolved from someone frustrated by problems he couldn't solve into a confident operations manager who anticipated challenges and developed solutions before they could impact project timelines. Diana, the client feedback from this quarter is extraordinary, Brandon said, spreading the survey results across the conference table. 96% satisfaction ratings, with specific praise for our communication, timeline management, and problem-solving capabilities. 3 clients have specifically requested that we handle their future projects exclusively, and 2 have recommended us to colleagues in other markets. Diana studied the surveys with satisfaction that went beyond simple business success. The comments from clients revealed that Kowalski Sons had achieved exactly what she'd envisioned, a reputation for delivering exceptional results through transparent communication and collaborative problem-solving. More importantly, the feedback demonstrated that her modernization efforts had enhanced rather than replaced the company's traditional commitment to quality craftsmanship. Patricia Hendricks arrived for the quarterly meeting carrying architectural plans for the largest development project Cedar Falls had ever attempted, a mixed-use complex that would transform the downtown area and serve as a model for sustainable urban development throughout the region. Her partnership with Diana had evolved into one of the most productive professional relationships in either of their careers, combining Patricia's development expertise with Diana's innovative construction management to create projects that exceeded everyone's original expectations. "Diana, I have news that's going to change everything for Kowalski Sons," Patricia announced, spreading the architectural drawings across the conference table. "The State Economic Development Office has selected our partnership for a showcase project that will demonstrate sustainable construction techniques throughout Oregon. This isn't just a local contract. It's a model that could be replicated in communities across the Pacific Northwest." Diana examined the plans with growing excitement, recognizing that the project represented validation of everything she'd been building toward since her acquisition of the company. The scope was ambitious enough to establish Kowalski Sons as a major player in regional construction markets, while the sustainable development focus aligned perfectly with the expertise and reputation they'd been cultivating over the past year. But the most significant aspect of Patricia's announcement was what it represented about Diana's transformation from dismissed housewife to recognized industry leader. The conference room where Diana's acquisition proposal had once been met with skepticism had become a hub for collaborative planning, now filled with diverse voices from all levels of the company. The rigid hierarchy that once limited innovation under family control had been replaced with a culture of cooperation, where creativity and continuous improvement thrived. As Diana locked up her office and headed to her car, she thought about the incredible path she had taken from an overlooked observer to a leader reshaping an entire industry. The years of dismissal and doubt had been difficult, but they had also served as the perfect training ground for the real challenges and responsibilities of leadership. Driving home, she passed construction sites where Kowalski Sons crews were building projects unimaginable under the old regime homes, crafted with sustainable materials. Commercial buildings with forward-thinking accessibility designs. Public spaces born from true collaboration between builders, designers, and the community. Each project symbolized more than profit. They embodied progress, empowerment, and long-term impact for Cedar Falls. At home, Diana found Brandon reviewing blueprints for their next major endeavor. His energy and focus reflected the transformation in their partnership now built on mutual respect and shared vision. "Diana," he said, looking up with excitement, "Patricia just sent the preliminary designs for the state showcase project. It's like nothing Oregon's ever seen: surplus energy systems, full accessibility integration, sustainable from top to bottom. It's going to redefine what construction can look like in this region." As Diana reviewed the plans, she saw more than an ambitious blueprint. She saw the realization of everything she'd fought for since taking over the company. It was a project big enough to establish Kowalski Sons as a leader in sustainable development and rooted enough to bring real lasting benefits to their own community. But more than that, the project symbolized the triumph of perseverance, vision, and the refusal to be confined by others' limited expectations. The woman once written off as obsolete had not only defied that judgment, she had built something enduring in its place. Working alongside Brandon on project timelines and logistics, Diana understood that the most powerful transformation wasn't just the modernization of a company or the renewal of a town's construction industry. It was the realization that being underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed could actually be a source of strength. The notebook she once used to privately document strategies now served as guides for other aspiring entrepreneurs facing similar battles for recognition. Her strategic patience, developed during 3 long years of being ignored, had become a competitive edge, one that helped her identify solutions and opportunities others overlooked. 6 months later, the state showcase project was completed. Early and under budget, it won national praise for its innovation and sustainability. Then came a call that marked a full-circle moment in Diana's journey. The U.S. Department of Commerce invited her to serve on a national advisory board focused on small business development in rural areas. She would now help shape policies and programs for communities like Cedar Falls, sharing the hard-earned lessons from her own transformation. The woman once dismissed as irrelevant had become a nationally recognized authority sought out by government and industry leaders alike. Her path from invisible to influential had required deep resilience, long preparation, and the bravery to act when the time was right. Ultimately, Diana Walsh proved that being overlooked isn't a disadvantage. It's a chance to grow in silence, gather strength, and prepare for the moment when the world finally notices. And when that moment comes, it can spark change not just for one person or one company, but for entire communities and industries. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.